Imagine a peaceful community where everyone strives to live harmoniously and follow the rules to maintain a good living environment. But in a small neighborhood in Oakwood Estates, not everyone is able to enjoy that peace. Because here, there is one woman named Karen, who has turned the HOA into a tyrannical regime no one dares to challenge. Karen is a nightmare for every resident in Oakwood Estates. No infraction, no matter how small, is safe from her scrutiny. Every violation could mean a fine, and sometimes even eviction. But things are about to change when a new neighbor moves into the area. Someone Karen never imagined would stand up to her. On a hot summer day, Colonel Naomi Campbell, a decorated U.S. Army veteran with over 20 years of service, moves to Oakwood Estates. Karen wastes no time in starting her harassment, demanding Naomi comply with the HOA's strict regulations. However, when Karen meets a woman who refuses to be intimidated, things escalate quickly. What begins as a dispute over a potted plant turns into a battle of power and respect. Can Naomi stand up to Karen and help free the community from her oppressive rule? It will soon become clear that sometimes, all it takes is one person to make a difference. Follow this dramatic story of justice, courage, and the fight for what's right. A quiet suburb in crisis. Oakwood Estates was, on the surface, the kind of suburban neighborhood that many dream of. A tree-lined street, meticulously manicured lawns, and homes with large windows that invited in the sun's golden rays. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other from their front porches, children ride their bikes in the cul-de-sac, and the only sounds that break the serenity are the chirps of birds and the occasional dog barking in the distance. It was a picture-perfect community, and to the outside world, it represented the ideal suburban dream. But like many things in life, Oakwood Estates hid a darker, more suffocating truth beneath its polished surface. For the residents who lived within its confines, Oakwood Estates was a prison, and the warden was Karen Whitman, the all-powerful president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with strong opinions. She was the undisputed ruler of the entire community. In her eyes, every aspect of the neighborhood, every blade of grass, every tree, every mailbox, was her responsibility to govern. And if you crossed her, you would feel the weight of her wrath. Karen's reign was not something you could easily ignore. It wasn't just about enforcing a few rules or maintaining property values. No, Karen took it to the extreme. She lived and breathed her HOA position, turning it into an iron-fisted dictatorship where her every whim became law. There were no compromises. There was no room for negotiation. Her word was the final decree. For years, the residents of Oakwood Estates endured her constant surveillance, her relentless lists of petty rules, and her unyielding control over their every move. But it wasn't always this way. Oakwood Estates had once been a place of harmony. People moved there to escape the chaos of city life, to raise families in a calm, safe environment. They believed they could create a strong, united community. But as time passed, something had shifted. Something that had turned what was once a quiet neighborhood into a battleground for power. The tyrant with a clipboard. Every morning, Karen would wake up before dawn, dressed in her perfectly pressed attire, ready to patrol the neighborhood like a soldier preparing for battle. Her first weapon, a clipboard, which she used to record violations of her ever-growing list of rules. Nothing was too small to escape her scrutiny. She had a meticulous eye for detail, one that had been honed over years of watching for infractions. A blade of grass that was too tall, a mailbox that was too crooked, a garbage can that was visible for even a second too long. These were all grounds for a violation notice. Take Sarah Thompson, for instance, a longtime resident of Oakwood Estates, who one fateful morning received a bright yellow violation notice stuck to her front door. The time? 6:05 a.m. The reason? Her garbage can was visible from the street. The problem was, Sarah had overslept by just 5 minutes, and pickup had been at exactly 6 a.m. It wasn't as though she had left the can out for hours, but to Karen, it didn't matter. The violation was issued, and the fine was waiting. And Sarah wasn't the only one. There were countless others who had felt the sting of Karen's wrath over what seemed like trivial issues. Mark Rodriguez, another longtime resident, could tell you all about it. His young daughter, in a simple act of kindness and creativity, had set up a lemonade stand to raise money for a school trip. 10 minutes later, Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, demanding to see a business license. A business license? For a lemonade stand? The absurdity was beyond comprehension, but Karen wasn't known for her sense of humor. She threatened to call the police if the stand wasn't immediately shut down. The young girl was reduced to tears, and the lemonade stand was no more. It wasn't just about the rules, it was about control. The residents had become pawns in Karen's game, each of them terrified to step out of line, to challenge her in any way. There was no room for freedom, no room for spontaneity, no room for joy. Everything had to conform to Karen's vision of perfection, and those who dared to defy her would face consequences. The surveillance state of Oakwood Estates. As time passed, Karen's power only grew. What started as petty violations escalated into financial penalties, eviction notices, and public shaming. Neighbors began to live in fear, walking on eggshells every day, terrified that they might unknowingly break one of her countless rules. They couldn't even have a friend visit without Karen making unannounced appearances to question who they were and how long they planned to stay. And then came the cameras. Karen had installed security cameras throughout the neighborhood, ostensibly for the safety of all, but in reality, they were simply another tool for her to monitor every move the residents made. Emily Chun, a newer resident, summed up the experience best. It felt like we were living in a prison. The cameras weren't just for show. They were an ever-present reminder of Karen's omnipresence, of her watchful eye that never blinked. And with each passing day, more and more residents became trapped in their own homes, afraid to venture out without fear of what Karen might accuse them of. The sense of community that had once existed in Oakwood Estates was all but gone. People had become isolated, afraid, and reluctant to even make eye contact with one another. Neighbors who once greeted each other with a smile now hurried past, avoiding confrontation at all costs. A new hope, Colonel Naomi Campbell. For years, it seemed like nothing could stop Karen's reign of terror. The residents had grown accustomed to the daily stress, the constant tension, and the unspoken rule that you did what Karen said, no questions asked. But in 2024, a new chapter began for Oakwood Estates, one that no one could have predicted. It was a warm summer day when the moving truck pulled up to number 17, Oakwood Drive. The house had been empty for months, its previous occupants having fled in the night, unable to bear the suffocating grip of Karen's control. The movers unloaded boxes and furniture, and with each passing moment, the anticipation grew. And then, out of nowhere, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway, and the door opened. A woman stepped out, tall and commanding, her posture straight as a rod, her uniform impeccably pressed. She was not just any newcomer. This was Colonel Naomi Campbell, a decorated U.S. Army officer with more than 20 years of service, a veteran of multiple tours, and a leader respected by all who knew her. She was the embodiment of discipline, integrity, and authority, everything that Karen was not. As Naomi surveyed her new home, Karen was watching from across the street, her eyes narrowing. She had seen many new residents come and go over the years, but there was something different about this one. This wasn't just another homeowner she could intimidate with her HOA rules. No, this was someone who had faced far more formidable opponents than her. Karen couldn't know it yet, but the clash of these two forces, Karen's tyrannical rule and Naomi's steadfast integrity, was going to change Oakwood Estates forever. The inevitable clash. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. The confrontation between Karen and Colonel Campbell was coming. The question was, who would win? Who would emerge victorious in this battle of wills, of power, of respect? The residents, once so frightened and passive, would soon find themselves on the edge of their seats, watching as two very different types of leaders clashed in a struggle for control of their community. This was no longer just about HOA rules. It was about justice. It was about standing up to tyranny. And as the days passed, the tension between Karen and Naomi would only grow, setting the stage for a showdown that would make history in Oakwood Estates. But what happened next? How would Naomi, with her calm demeanor and years of military training, handle the escalating situation? How would Karen, who had ruled with fear for so long, respond to the challenge of someone who wasn't afraid of her? The story was just beginning, and soon, the lives of everyone in Oakwood Estates would be changed forever. A conflict brewing under the surface. The sun shone brightly over Oakwood Estates that fateful summer day when Colonel Naomi Campbell first laid eyes on her new home. But as peaceful as the surroundings seemed, something far more turbulent simmered beneath the surface. Naomi had already sensed the tension in the air when she first walked the quiet streets. Something was off, a subtle but undeniable strain in the community. Her military instincts told her that Oakwood Estates wasn't the idyllic place it appeared to be. Naomi had seen it all during her time in the army. Combat zones, life-and-death decisions, soldiers relying on her leadership in the harshest of circumstances. But this suburban setting, which seemed so harmless, held its own kind of battle, one she hadn't expected to face. Karen Whitman, the HOA president, had established a reign of control over the community that was practically unchallenged. As a woman of power, Karen had used her position to manipulate the residents, using fear and intimidation as her weapons of choice. But the truth was, she was also deeply insecure. Her iron-fisted rule was a mask for a deep-seated fear of losing control. The authority she wielded was the only thing that gave her any sense of power, and she wasn't about to let anyone challenge that. Karen watched Naomi with increasing wariness. Unlike most residents who would be cowed by her attention and relent to her rules without question, Naomi stood tall, confident, and unyielding in her presence. She didn't flinch, didn't give an inch. For Karen, this was a direct challenge, a signal that her reign might finally be coming to an end. The first confrontation. The storm didn't take long to brew. Just a few days after Naomi had settled into her new home, Karen arrived at her doorstep, clipboard in hand. Naomi had been preparing for this moment, knowing that Karen's rule wouldn't go unchallenged for long. What Karen didn't know was that Naomi was a master of diplomacy, trained in conflict resolution and grounded in years of managing soldiers in high-stress situations. She wasn't intimidated by a petty HOA president, especially not one who used her power to belittle others. The issue, however, was seemingly trivial. A potted plant that Naomi had placed on her front porch. Karen stormed up the driveway, her eyes narrowed with disapproval. Naomi, who had just returned from unpacking her last few boxes, was standing at her front door when Karen approached. "You people never learn, do you?" Karen spat as she made her way to Naomi's porch. "I've told you 100 times about unauthorized decorations. This is non-compliant." Naomi, taken aback by the hostility but remaining composed, answered calmly, "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met. My name is Colonel Naomi Campbell. I just moved in last week." The words were intended to defuse the situation. However, Karen wasn't having any of it. The formality of Naomi's introduction seemed to only ignite her fury further. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. Rules are rules, and you're breaking them," Karen retorted, her voice sharp and filled with disdain. Naomi stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. Karen had underestimated her, but Naomi wasn't about to give in to such petty attacks. She drew upon years of experience managing hostile situations and said, "I understand you're concerned about the neighborhood's appearance. Perhaps we could review the HOA guidelines together." But Karen wasn't interested in dialogue. She wasn't interested in cooperation. What happened next would shake Oakwood Estates to its core. In a fit of rage, Karen shoved the potted plant off the porch. It crashed to the ground, scattering soil and ceramic shards everywhere. "There," Karen sneered. "Now it's in compliance." For a moment, Naomi's mind flashed to the military. She had faced far more dangerous situations, had led soldiers through situations that could have cost them their lives. But this was personal. It wasn't just about rules, it was about respect. And in that moment, Naomi realized she couldn't let Karen trample over her or the community any longer. "Ma'am, I must ask you to leave my property immediately." Naomi's voice was steady, but her eyes were cold, filled with a fire that burned with righteousness. "This behavior is unacceptable." But Karen, fueled by an arrogance that was becoming dangerously out of control, didn't back down. She stepped forward, jabbing her finger into Naomi's chest. "You listen here, you slur," Karen spat, using a racial slur that made the onlookers gasp. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. The incident was more than just about property disputes. It was a blatant attack on her dignity, her values, and her military service. The fallout begins. The impact of Karen's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Naomi's calmness only intensified the sting of Karen's aggression. But Naomi's reaction was calculated. She was not going to let this slide. And Karen? She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. As Karen's words continued to echo in the neighborhood, Naomi took a deep breath. Her military training kicked in, as she responded with the authority of someone who had seen far worse than this. "Mrs. Whitman, I want you to listen carefully. Your actions today constitute harassment, property damage, and what could be classified as a hate crime. As a serving officer in the United States Army, I am obligated to report this incident to my superiors at the Pentagon." For the first time, Karen's confident, domineering demeanor faltered. "The Pentagon?" she stammered, her bravado evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. The realization of what she had just done hit her like a freight train. "Yes, the Pentagon," Naomi confirmed. "They take these matters very seriously, especially when they involve discrimination against military personnel. I suggest you prepare yourself for a thorough investigation." The look on Karen's face said it all. In an instant, she had gone from a powerful HOA president with complete control over her community to someone who was suddenly exposed. Karen's own fear began to rise as she realized that Naomi wasn't bluffing. Naomi wasn't some homeowner she could bully. She was a military officer with the full backing of the U.S. Army. Within minutes, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, arrived in Oakwood Estates. The military had taken Naomi's complaint seriously. Investigators began questioning residents, collecting evidence, and piecing together the stories of abuse and manipulation that had haunted Oakwood Estates for years. And with each passing hour, more and more residents who had lived in silence under Karen's rule began to speak up. The unraveling of Karen's power. Mark Rodriguez, who had seen his young daughter threatened over a lemonade stand, came forward with his story. Emily Chun, who had felt like a prisoner in her own home under Karen's surveillance, shared her experiences. The floodgates opened, and Karen's empire began to crumble. The once feared HOA president was now a pariah, and the residents of Oakwood Estates, emboldened by Naomi's stand, rallied together. They had been living under the thumb of a dictator for far too long, but now they were reclaiming their power. They were finally fighting back. But Karen's problems didn't end with the CID investigation. The HOA board, once loyal to her every command, was now considering her removal from office. Karen had lost the support of the very people who had once feared her. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out now greeted each other with warm smiles and openly shared their experiences. The silence that had pervaded Oakwood Estates for years was being replaced by the sound of people speaking up and standing together. The rise of a community. For Naomi, the battle wasn't just personal. It was about something much larger. She had stepped into a broken community, and now she was leading the charge to restore it. The impact of her bravery rippled through Oakwood Estates, and it became clear that one person's courage could inspire an entire neighborhood to stand up for what was right. But for Karen, the fall was swift and unforgiving. Once untouchable, she was now facing the consequences of her actions, with the potential for criminal charges looming. The truth of her mismanagement and overreach had finally been exposed, and there was no escaping the consequences. As the investigation continued and the community began to rebuild, one thing was clear. Oakwood Estates would never be the same again. The aftermath of Karen's downfall. The days following the explosive confrontation between Karen Whitman and Colonel Naomi Campbell marked the beginning of an irreversible change for Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood, which had lived under Karen's oppressive rule for years, was now in the midst of a quiet revolution. What had once been a place of tension, fear, and mistrust was slowly evolving into a community rooted in solidarity, mutual respect, and fairness. As the investigation into Karen's actions unfolded, the town that had previously been terrified of standing up to her began to find its voice. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID team worked tirelessly, interviewing neighbors, collecting evidence, and ensuring that no stone was left unturned. The weight of Karen's actions became more apparent with each passing day. Fines, harassment, and unwarranted evictions were just the beginning of the list of offenses that had quietly marred the lives of Oakwood Estates residents. But the biggest shock came when it was revealed that the HOA's finances, under Karen's control, had been mismanaged for years. Audit reports uncovered discrepancies, potential embezzlement, and a troubling pattern of misallocation of funds. The evidence pointed toward Karen not just abusing her power but actively exploiting it for personal gain. This discovery sent shockwaves through the community, and those who had once feared her began to speak up. The rise of community solidarity. For many residents, speaking up was not an easy choice. Years of intimidation, fear of retribution, and silence had taken their toll. However, Naomi's courageous actions had sparked a ripple effect, empowering others to share their experiences. Mark Rodriguez, who had previously been too afraid to confront Karen over the lemonade stand incident, shared his story with the investigators. His daughter, who had once been reduced to tears by Karen's threats, became a symbol of the fear that had paralyzed so many of Oakwood's residents. Emily Chun, who had been under constant surveillance, recounting how Karen had installed cameras in public spaces, began to realize that her fear was no longer necessary. With every story that emerged, the truth of Karen's reign of terror grew clearer. The most heartening shift, however, was not just the willingness to speak out, but the renewed sense of community that began to form among the neighbors. No longer did people walk past each other in silence, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Instead, impromptu gatherings began to spring up on front lawns and driveways. People shared stories, laughed, and began the long process of rebuilding the trust and solidarity that Karen had systematically broken down. It was in these moments, simple acts of togetherness, that the true power of Naomi's bravery began to be realized. Her stand didn't just defeat a tyrant. It reignited a sense of shared purpose and belonging. Oakwood Estates was healing, the HOA's response and the community's rebirth. As the investigation into Karen progressed, the HOA board, once too fearful to act, was finally forced to confront the truth. In a swift and dramatic meeting, Karen was removed from her position as president of the HOA. The community had spoken, and Karen's grip on power had been completely loosened. The process of rebuilding Oakwood Estates had already begun, but it wasn't going to happen overnight. The new HOA board, now made up of more transparent and community-oriented individuals, took immediate steps to review and revise the HOA guidelines. They instituted more transparent financial practices, started regular community meetings, and worked to ensure that residents had a voice in decision-making. The positive changes weren't just limited to policy. With Karen no longer able to terrorize the neighborhood, neighbors began to speak freely. Residents who had been hesitant to engage with one another now shared their ideas and concerns openly. The first few weeks were marked by a wave of new friendships being formed, long-standing grievances being aired, and even neighborhood events being planned for the first time in years. Barbecues, street cleanups, and even a community talent show became symbols of Oakwood Estates' revival. The community no longer lived in fear. They had reclaimed their voice, and with that voice came the power to shape their future. The consequences for Karen. Despite the communal healing, Karen's consequences were far from over. The financial audits not only revealed significant discrepancies, but also raised concerns about potential criminal activity. Embezzlement was suspected, and the local authorities began working in tandem with the military to build a case against Karen. The HOA board, in a final effort to clean up the mess that Karen had left behind, called for a full audit of the HOA's records over the past decade. It was clear that Karen had manipulated the system to maintain her dominance. But now, with the community's collective will behind them, it was time to right the wrongs. Soon, Karen was summoned for an official investigation into her financial misconduct and her role in the discrimination against military families. Her past decisions, once made from a position of unchallenged power, were now under intense scrutiny. The threat of criminal charges loomed over her head, and as news of her impending legal battle spread, the community watched with growing anticipation. For many, the most poetic part of Karen's downfall was the fact that it had all started because she had underestimated someone. Someone who had the strength, courage, and resolve to stand up against her. Colonel Naomi Campbell, a woman who had seen more battlefields than most, had taken on the fight at Oakwood Estates, and now, the entire neighborhood was benefiting from her courage. The lessons of Oakwood Estates. As Oakwood Estates slowly rebuilt itself, the lesson from the entire saga became crystal clear. No one person should have unchecked power, especially when that power is used to bully, intimidate, and discriminate. Karen's reign had been allowed to continue for so long because of fear and complacency. It was the silence of the majority that had allowed her to thrive. But as Naomi's courage proved, the silence doesn't last forever. A single voice, a single act of courage, can spark a change that ripples through an entire community. Naomi Campbell had taken the first step, and from there, the entire neighborhood found its voice. The power of community solidarity was restored, and Oakwood Estates was no longer a place ruled by fear but one where fairness, justice, and respect took precedence. In the wake of Karen's removal, Oakwood Estates began to serve as a model for other communities. Neighborhoods began to examine their own HOA structures, and many pushed for greater transparency and accountability within their organizations. What had started as a local issue in Oakwood Estates soon became a larger conversation about the importance of democratic participation in local governance and the need to hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The final chapter, Hope for the Future. As the months passed, Oakwood Estates transformed. The sting of the past began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of optimism for the future. The once divided, fractured neighborhood was now united by a shared belief in fairness and equality. People who had never spoken to each other before now shared their dreams for the neighborhood's future. There were talks of planting new trees, organizing more community events, and even starting a neighborhood watch program to ensure that Oakwood Estates would always be a place of safety and solidarity. But the true legacy of the Oakwood Estates saga was the reminder that change starts with one person willing to stand up against injustice. Naomi Campbell didn't just fight for her own dignity. She fought for the dignity of every resident in the neighborhood. Her actions ignited a wave of change that spread far beyond her doorstep. And in the end, Oakwood Estates became a symbol of what can happen when a community stands together. The story of Oakwood Estates serves as a beacon of hope for anyone who feels powerless in the face of oppressive systems. Whether it's an abusive HOA president, a corrupt institution, or a neighborhood that has been divided by fear, the message is clear. One voice can change everything. Naomi Campbell's courage didn't just bring justice to Oakwood Estates. It brought hope to anyone who has ever felt silenced. And it proved, once again, that the fight for what is right is worth it, even when the stakes are high.